Let's say a very good morning to Tim Montgomerie, former number 10 advisor, Conservative stalwart. I want to know what he thinks of not only what the Tories are up to, but what the Labour Party are up to as well. Tim, a very good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, the lesson, Mike, is given what you just said, we're not going to let you go on any mini breaks anymore. Disasters seem to strike at every turn when you're away. We need you in that hot seat to fight all these things, prevent them from happening.
Do you know, there was a time when I was in Fleet Street, every time I went on holiday, some senior editor got fired. You know, Andrew Neil was fired when I was on holiday. Kelvin Mackenzie was fired when I was on holiday. Sir Nick Lloyd was fired when I was on holiday. Anyway, enough of that. But what is going on back here? I'd like to set off, I think, at the beginning of this conversation, the water crisis which we're now facing. Thames Water has apparently got itself into so much debt that it won't be able to survive without some government help. How have we let the water business get so toxic?
I think you have to see this, Mike, in the context of Britain really underinvesting in everything, whether it's our railways, whether it's our nuclear electricity generation capacity. We're just not very good as a country, and I think actually this applies to a lot of Western democracies, about spending money on long-term infrastructure. Rather, you know, you've just been talking about the pay demands of doctors. It's easier if you're an elected politician or a business which has, you know, quarterly results constantly being posted on the stock exchange, which investors look at. It's easier to pay dividends, or it's easier to pay the pay demands of workers rather than improve our sewerage or build those nuclear power stations or build those, you know, motorways. And something has to change. I don't know what it is, but if we're going to compete with China, if we're going to compete with, you know, the rising authoritarian regimes, we have to change the way we use our money.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But the trouble is, it seems as though we've only like woken up from some long, deep sleep and worked out that we haven't been doing anything for a very long time. And I don't blame it all on the Tory party for the last 13 years. I blame it also on the kind of fascination that the Labour Party had under Blair and Brown for the financial sector and financial services, which seemed to be the only thing that they believed in. And they pumped it up to such an extent that it exploded in sort of 2008. But in the end, you know, we have neglected our utilities, we have neglected our roads, our rail systems, as everything you say. You know, we don't seem to have maintained them. And in a way, that is the fault of, I don't know, quangos, governments, everybody, isn't it?
Well, look, the privatisation system, the idea was, both you and I, Mike, are old enough to remember this. Some of our viewers might not be. Some of our viewers and listeners might not be. But, you know, British Railways didn't really build any railways when it was under nationalisation. In fact, you know, the beaching reforms meant a lot of railways were closed. And you can look at that again and again with most of the nationalised industries. They didn't invest because of what I've just said. Government is under enormous electoral pressure all the time. Politicians don't think, I'll put this money in 10 years' time, we'll have that new railway or whatever. And they just invest in short-term things. The idea of privatising these companies was to ensure that they were run efficiently and they could borrow long-term on the stock exchange for things like investment. I think we probably need to keep these companies privatised, therefore, because I don't think nationalisation is the answer. But somehow the regulatory regime needs to change so that they're encouraged to take more of the long-term decisions that we need for ensure we have clean water and efficient railways and the rest of it.
Well, it doesn't seem to be asking too much for a reasonably successful world economy to be able to have services that you can rely on. But more and more people tell me that they feel they live in a sort of country that's almost on the decline because nothing works. You can't really get from point A to point B. I mean, even yesterday I came off the plane at Gatwick and the travelator, whatever you want to call that moving escalator thing, had been completely closed off, and it was sort of like for me, a welcome back to Britain sign, because it was all black and yellow kind of, you know, curtains, nobody working to fix it, just saying it was under construction. And you're thinking, well, why? Why does it not work? Why is it so useless? You know, I went to Cyprus. I know it's a much smaller country with a lot fewer people in it, but everything sort of worked quite well. You know, and you didn't get that sense that we get here, where everything is basically kind of broken.
My suspicion, Mike, is that travelator wasn't broken. properly broken. I suspect there was a little issue with it, and they were very worried because of the litigious culture we work in today, that if even though there was 0.1% chance that something had gone wrong, someone had fallen on the travelator when it had stopped or something, they would be sued. And that's a lot of the trouble with why things don't happen in Britain, or why everything is so expensive compared to other countries. Is there's so much health and safety, there's so much equalities, there's so much legislation that doesn't really have to do with anything actually working physically or mechanically. It's we've become a culture which gold plates everything that happens, and that travelator probably could have been turned on very easily, but some lawyer or some very cautious manager had said, no, I can't afford to do this. And who's inconvenienced is always you and other passengers.
Exactly.
Not the supervisors, because they're never held accountable for that decision.
Right. And again, much of it, and I know this from watching the regulator, certainly in the water industry and in the electricity industry and in the power and energy sector, we've got water bills. A story today, water bills will need to rise 40% to meet the cost of pollution targets. And a second story about an £84 green carbon tax needs to be slashed in order to help households. We also heard over the last few days that Rishi Sunak's going to put back the £170 green levy, which Liz Truss had removed, costing people even more money.
Well, one of the things that has happened while they've been away, Mike, is Rishi Sunak's ratings have really plummeted. He's now at sort of minus 31% in the opinion polls. Look, I think if Jesus Christ returned to earth this very day and somehow, I don't know the theology of this, but became Tory leader, I think the Tories would still lose the next general election. I don't think we can blame Rishi Sunak for all of the Tories' ills. He inherited a lot of them. You mentioned Liz Truss. But unfortunately, he isn't speaking to the country at all. I follow politics incredibly closely. I don't know what his vision is for Britain. I don't know what his answer would be to, for example, the water crisis. He gives little announcements, but he doesn't tell us what his big plan is. And if the Tories are going to at least get close to the next election so that they have a number of MPs that keeps them competitive in British politics, he has to really improve his game, and he needs to improve his game quite quickly. Yeah, I mean, he can't just keep telling us how well he's doing and how smooth the economy is and how well he's running everything, because it's clearly not happening. And he can't keep telling us he's stopping the boats either, by the way, because that's not happening either. But, it is extraordinary, isn't it, that Rishi Sunak has become so unpopular, not least because he just hasn't really done anything. And the Tory party are leading a very high tax regime now. People are struggling to make ends meet, and yet he's not helping them. He's not helping anybody. No, and he can't just say, well, I became Prime Minister 6 months ago. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer for most of this Parliament. And he had a picture of Nigel Lawson on his wall. Nigel Lawson was one of my favourite chancellors during the Thatcher years. Every budget he had, he made a big reform, whether it was cutting taxes in some way, simplifying taxes. Rishi Sunak didn't use any of his budgets for big reforms. And so he can't really distance himself from the government's problems. He's been implicated in them, throughout this period in 2019. Yeah, and one fast point there on the Sermon on the Mount and the reappearance of Jesus Christ. He couldn't do the miracle of the loaves and the fishes because grain's too expensive and we've given all the fish away to the French. But that's just a passing thought. We'll come back to you, Tim. Stay where you are. An investigation has been launched. Here's another one, a great thing that happened while I was away, into BT after a disruption to 999 emergency call services. Ofcom has today opened an investigation after the UK-wide issue on the 25th of June. Certainly, people couldn't call 999. We'll get into that a little bit further along the track. But we're talking to Tim Montgomerie. Coming back, we're going to talk about the situation regarding Keir Starmer. He said he wants to make families the centre point of his policy. Also, we'll talk about this guy who's running for Mayor of London. Not many people have heard of him until yesterday, and suddenly now he's at the centre of a groping scandal. This is TalkTV. Getting some great tweets and messages coming in about the water and the problems with water. Sandy says this: having lived on the island of Tenerife, I can tell you they have no water shortages despite it being warmer and drier than the UK. Underinvestment here, yep, on everything except the contents of the dinghies. And here's one from Kingsley. He says, Mike, the water system in Spain works well.
it works by the local governments retaining ownership of the system, but bidding companies are given a 10-year franchise to run it with strict targets. If they fail, you don't have to buy it back. The franchise just isn't renewed. Interesting. We'll keep up that conversation about water, because Thames Water is obviously going to be a big story in the next couple of days. And we told you about an investigation being launched into BT after disruptions at 999 emergency services calls. But let's have a look, just before we go back to Tim Montgomerie, former number 10 advisor, and an interview, a great interview last night, Kate McCann did with a hopeful mayoral candidate who is basically wishing to become the next Sadiq Khan. His name is Daniel Korski. He's a former number 10 advisor. In fact, he led the Remain campaign inside David Cameron's government. So he hasn't exactly got a great track record, you'd have to say. But here he is talking about his relationship with his wife.
It's a difficult question, but it's an important one, I think, in the context of what we're talking about. And no doubt this will have an impact on your wider life and your family. Have you always been faithful to your wife?
Look, I mean, I have a fantastic marriage to my wife, and I'm really, excited that we've built a fantastic family together. I don't think it would be appropriate to talk about anything else. I have a loving relationship with my wife. We've been together for 22 years, I think it is now. We met originally in Bosnia after the war, and I'm thrilled to build a life and a family with her.
Well, not sure what you make of an answer like that to a question like that. Tim Montgomerie, I don't know whether you knew him in number 10 or whether your paths didn't quite cross. I think he left with Cameron, didn't he? Yeah,
I did know Daniel, and has always struck me as a very thoughtful and interesting person, very clued up on technology, and heard some of the interviews he's done as part of his mayoral campaign, and I've been very impressed with him. I think Tory HQ are wrong to immediately say they won't investigate the allegations made against him.
Yeah.
Equally, though, I don't think he should have to talk about every aspect of his marriage. If, there may well have been problems in his marriage, I don't know. But I don't think we require people, wanting to stand in public life to have to reveal everything about their private lives. If we go down that route, no one will want to stand for public life because of, journalistic interference in every aspect of their life. I don't know the truth of the allegations made about Daniel Korski. I suspect what will happen if the allegations of groping are true, that other women will come forward following yesterday's story in the Times and make other allegations against Daniel Korski. Normally what happens, if someone does grope a woman once, it won't be the only time they've done so. They will have done so on other occasions. If no other allegations come forward, I would be minded to think that Daniel Korski will survive this one allegation. But as you say, we'll probably know in the next 2 or 3 days.
I mean, one of the things that struck me about just the story generally is that before this moment, I didn't really know who Daniel Korski was, and I suspect neither did anybody else. And yet there were a couple of other slightly more what you might call high-profile propositions, Paul Scully being one of them, who weren't selected. And you wonder why that was.
Well, this is what really irritates me sometimes about the Conservative Party. Paul Scully is a really talented guy. He was a minister in Rishi Sunak's government, and they put him through the whole process of, long-listing for the Tory London mayoral candidacy, and then didn't put him on the shortlist. Talk about humiliating one of your own MPs by the process. In any sort of sensible operation, someone would have said before he stood at all, look, Paul, I think it's unlikely we'll shortlist you for these whatever reasons, whatever they might be. Don't stand, because the last thing we want to do would be undermine you as a local MP.
Yeah, exactly.
But the Tory party couldn't even get the sort of basic personnel management like that right, which is just another manifestation of why the Tory party isn't in a good place.
Yeah, slightly worrying. Speaking of them not being in a good place, what about the Labour Party? You were quite complimentary about a Keir Starmer interview on Twitter yesterday, where he says that he basically wants to try and get back to the old-fashioned value. It sounds old-fashioned, it shouldn't, where he says he wants working people to be able to get on in life, to make sure that your children have more chances than you did, which used to be a sort of guaranteed sort of situation in this country. My parents came from very working class stock. They sort of became middle class. They then, produced me, and you can call me whatever you want, but I'm certainly not working class, I don't think. There is a sort of a social movement that has been going on in the past few generations, but it seems to have stopped.
Yeah. Well, look, Mike, I don't know about your circumstances, and I don't fully know about Keir's circumstances. What I can say is that you get all sorts of privileges when you were born, money or whatever. But I think the greatest privilege is to have in your corner throughout your life a mum and dad who believe in you. For me, there is no, greater love, no greater force for good in civilization than the love that parents will give to their children. And I think it's why we're so offended when we see, any kind of child abuse by parents. It's so against the natural order. Well, lots of families fail for all sorts of reasons. And by family, I mean the extended family as well. The role that aunts, uncles, grandparents play in the care of children. But when was the last time, Mike, you heard any politicians do any sort of substantial policy for the family? We have the most anti-family tax system in Europe. We are too much of an individualistic culture. And I make that criticism of the Conservatives as well as I would of Labour. And I just heard in Keir Starmer's interview yesterday, I didn't hear policy or whatever, but I heard a personal appreciation of how important the family had been to him. I just look for one day when a politician will say, I'm going to help other families stay together. We're going to encourage marriage. I'm going to encourage grandparents and aunts and uncles to be involved in the childcare of their children, not just going to pay for people to put children in paid for childcare and ignore the role that families play. That is just my wish.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And the breakdown of the family has been the root cause of an awful lot of the problems in our society, in terms of the welfare system, in terms of the unemployment systems, the benefit systems, all of that, is probably quite easily laid at very much at the beginning anyway of the breakdown of family. Let me finish up, Tim, with a word about cricket, because a big day today, second Ashes Test starts. I was laughing with Julia Hartley-Brewer. I'm not going to try and get into trouble about women's and men's cricket, but, the BBC are getting themselves in all sorts of trouble because they keep...
The award-winning Julia Hartley-Brewer.
My apologies, yes, the award-winning Julia Hartley-Brewer, of course. And she's still clutching it even as we speak, the award, which is great. They can't get their heads around calling it the Ashes, either for men or for women, so nobody knows which Ashes they're talking about anymore. But also, fundamentally, you were saying, again, on social media, what an unfortunate piece of timing for this piece of sort of so-called research to come out, saying that cricket is inevitably and essentially racist.
I don't know what it is about some of our institutions in the country. There's plenty wrong. We've been talking about some of the things that have been wrong in the last 20 minutes, Mike. But actually, English cricket in so many ways, like most sports, is very good at involving minorities. And yet, rather than sort of saying, there's room for improvement, we can do a little bit better here or there, we manage to sort of smash ourselves up too often and say we're irredeemably racist. Look across Europe, look across French television, for example. You don't see many people who are non-white. Again and again, at the top of politics in most of Europe, they don't have the diversity that we do. There is something about our country. We want to knock ourselves all the time. The press are partly to blame, but when the report came out yesterday, you were probably sunbathing or whatever you were doing on holiday. But on the Today programme, the people who put this report together, there was no critical questioning of them. They were saying, is this really true? Their findings that British cricket was racist were just accepted as true. And I think that's a libel on many good people who have given many years to the sport and don't deserve this race relations industry's constant attack on everything, because the race relations industry will never suddenly say the job of attacking racism is over, even though I think racism is on decline in Britain. They are on the search for more and more racism, and they will try and find it everywhere, partly by redefining what racism is.
Yes, exactly right. And when they're told, well, we can't find any evidence of that, well, they say, well, there's your proof. You've just said there's no evidence, therefore we must be right. It's a bizarre world. Tim, great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy the Ashes, whichever one it is that you're deciding to watch. Tim Montgomerie, former number 10 advisor there.